Hola a todos. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. My name is Irene Suarez, and I'll be your moderator for today's Restore Community webinar. Today, we will have two fantastic speakers to dive into the science that is promoting three key efforts. The first, it's about facilitating direct access of finance for Indigenous peoples, for farmers, for local communities and small, medium enterprises that are protecting and restoring ecosystems. The second is we're supporting business and financial institutions in their journey to net zero and in their contributions to reversing biodiversity loss, also known as nature positive journeys. And thirdly, we're promoting greater trust. We're promoting greater trust in efforts related to conservation of nature, restoration, and sustainable management, given that Restore enhances transparency on all of the above. So before we kick off this webinar session, I want to share a couple of house rules. First of all, we encourage everyone to introduce yourselves in the chat, including where you're from. Secondly, want to let you know that, as you just heard, this session will be recorded, so you will be able to share after. And no worries if you're unable to stay for the entire duration, you'll be able to catch up later. And lastly, we'll have a question and answer session at the end, so please share your questions in the chat, and we hope to address them at that time and also follow up later. So before we kick off, let me just remind to those that aren't aware what Restore is. I want to let you know that Restore is a science-based open platform that connects a global community of nature stewards to data, knowledge, resources, and markets, helping them grow. It builds transparency through high-resolution satellite imagery and a wide range of geospatial and scientific insights, enhancing visibility and accountability for funders, for governments, for business, for investors and communities alike. So this specific webinar is part of an ongoing series by Restore aimed at showcasing best practices and case studies from around the world. The goal is not only to inform projects on the ground, but also to foster a live opportunity for the global Restore community to connect amongst yourselves, as well as with Restore staff. It's up to all of us, ultimately, together, to contribute to build in transparency and connectivity within this vast global restoration movement for people and planet. Today, we'll discuss the state-of-art science behind Restore and the newly launched SEED Index. Both are vital tools driving transparency, accuracy, and actionable insights for the global restoration landscape. And before we get into their presentations, our speakers, will introduce briefly, I want to invite Marina Duarte, Restore's Regional Engagement Lead in Brazil, to quickly introduce a couple of poll questions so we can get a sense of who's with us in the room today. And again, please introduce yourselves in the chat as well. We really want to connect. Marina, over to you.
Amazing, Irene. Thank you very much. So welcome, everyone. As Irene said, we'd like to get to know a little bit more about you. So I'm sharing a poll with you. There are a couple of questions. The first one about your role in restoration and the second one about your interests. So I'd like to give you 1 or 2 minutes to respond, and then I will share the results with you. So please go ahead. Well, I guess most of you already responded. So I think you can see the results now, right? So most of you are from science or implementer or practitioners in restoration. And it's very good to see you have multiple interests in learning today, integrating global science on restore, geospatial data, practical advice on restoration projects, and funding. So I hope you enjoyed the session today. Back to you, Irene.
Gracias. Gracias, Marina. Obrigada. Now, so let me introduce our amazing speakers properly. So first, we're going to hear from Dr. Stephen Thomas, who's an ecological data specialist with the Crowther Lab. His work revolves around using innovative geospatial data to produce site-specific insights, turning vast data sets into actionable knowledge that enables restoration efforts around the world. Our second speaker, I have an honor to present, is Dr. Ian Brettel, who will introduce us to the SEED Index. And the SEED Index is a pioneering metric for evaluating the intactness of nature in a standardized fashion, helping us all understand and quantify the impact of our conservation and efforts. So thank you, Steve and Ian, for being with us today. And with that, let's jump to you, Dr. Stephen Thomas, and let you share how geospatial data empowers restoration efforts globally.
Great, thanks, Irene. I'll just share my screen of slide deck. Do you guys see this without the Zoom overlay that I can see?
Yes.
All good.
Perfect.
Yeah, so thanks. Yeah, great to see everyone. So I'm going to give, we've only got 10 minutes, but I'm going to give a very brief overview of kind of the science on Restore, where that data comes from, the difference between the satellite data we have on Restore and the model data, kind of the use cases for it, a bit of behind the scenes on how the data kind of actually is generated for individual sites, and then a bit about where we're thinking of going in the future with the data and how the process of kind of adding new data sets to the platform works. So I'll run through these slides with you guys quickly. So I guess as most of you guys, if you've played around with the Restore platform a bit, will be familiar, but it provides you kind of a host of scientific information for kind of any given location on the terrestrial surface of the Earth. If you just go into the platform and upload a polygon or kind of demarcate an area with the drawing tool, and that kind of spans quite a breadth of different topics. And like I said, we're looking to expand that, and I'll go into that a bit later on in the talk. But basically, it gives you data on kind of the physical aspects of the site, the ecology of the site, and a bit about the kind of socioeconomics, and that's something we're looking at building out further. And we put that together with the goal of having the data being useful if you want to plan, manage, or monitor a kind of a nature-based intervention that's going on the ground somewhere on the Earth's terrestrial surface. So that's kind of the goal. There's quite a big user group that the data is applicable to. So it might be practitioners actually working on the ground. It might be scientists advising them. It might be various other groups like NGOs working with or funding them. And it might be various other stakeholders they have all the way up to kind of large corporates who are kind of assisting with these nature-based interventions. So where does the data on Restore come from? So as I mentioned, once you go in and you add your polygon to the site, like almost instantaneously, within 5 seconds or so, you should be provided with this big list of data. And this is coming from various sources. So we obviously want to ensure that the data is accurate and kind of it's the best freely available scientific data for each of those, the kind of the buckets of metrics that we're trying to provide information on. So generally, we make sure that the data either is provided by a peer-reviewed scientific paper, so it came from the literature, or failing that, we do also include data. Sometimes it isn't peer-reviewed, but it comes from an organization we trust, basically. So a very large national or international or intergovernmental organization like NASA or the European Space Agency, who are freely providing satellite data, for example, as part of their remit. This is the aim of this was to democratize the data on Restore. So lots of this data, particularly the model stuff in the peer-reviewed literature, was kind of locked away behind paywalls and wasn't accessible to the general public. Or if it was, so sometimes the data was published online, but it was a map in a geospatial format that you need certain expertise to be able to interrogate, particularly if you want to just pull detailed information for a really small specific area that you're working on. So the idea was to kind of throw the doors open, unlock this, provide this to everyone, and then to move forward and continually kind of update this data as we go, and to continue to provide the best freely available information that can help people doing nature-based interventions on the ground by continuing to add new data sets and kind of new metrics about things that we didn't have data on before as they become available in the literature. So kind of quite broadly, and I'll explain a bit in the slide after this, kind of where the differentiation kind of matters. But we've got two major types of data on Restore. They do kind of, some data is kind of derived from both these methodologies, but to keep it simple, we can envisage the data as being satellite data or being model data. So with the satellite data, we've got kind of some kind of measurement of something happening on the ground for every single pixel on the Earth's terrestrial surface. These vary with spatial resolution and temporal resolution, depending on the data availability and the specifics of the satellite that's included. But all of these, there's some measurement of something physically going on the ground. So we can see, for example, the amount of carbon standing stock that's there, the amount of carbon that's being uptaken every year, or things like the amount of water cycling through the ground via evapotranspiration. So that is quite straightforward and direct and gives you kind of a way to quantify kind of baselines. So things like, what's the carbon like now? What was it like 5 years ago? And then like kind of look at that into the future, but then also monitoring rapidly changing things like the amount of carbon uptaken every year and how that kind of varies with the vegetation. And then more broadly, and I think this is most of the data sets on Restore, we have model data where we've got some indication of what we think a variable is like across the Earth's entire terrestrial surface, based on kind of what a model predicts, basically. And I'll explain that in the next slide. And the reason we include that model data is that it allows us to kind of go beyond what is actually happening now, which is what you see with the satellite data, to kind of give you an indication of kind of what could be happening at a given location, depending on, how you manage it or how you kind of intervene with the ecology of the site. So this can be things like, okay, so currently this is arable land, but we want to restore it. What would the tree density look like? What would the carbon standing stock look like after 20 years, for example? And what sort of species would this site support based on the prevailing environmental conditions? And then very briefly, so I'll give a brief overview of kind of this modeling approach, but also the Crowther Lab has published a really detailed scientific preprint explaining this methodology for going from ground observation data to this kind of wall-to-wall terrestrial surface map that you can then use for predictions for any polygon you want to upload. And I'll share this once I finish presenting. I'll share it in the chat. So anyone who really wants to dig into the details of this can. But to keep it very simple, generally, for these model predictions, whether they're coming from the lab, which lots of them are, or whether they're coming from other external labs or other groups we're collaborating with, or other people using the same approach, generally the methodology is more or less similar, and this is the Crowther Lab specific approach. So the crux of this is to kind of come up with something we want to predict, whether that's tree density, whether it's the amount of above ground carbon or something else, and like compile a very large data set of ground observations. So for the Crowther Labs data sets, this generally spans from tens of thousands of data points when we're looking at kind of observational data for like an individual tree species, up to millions of data points if we're looking at something like tree density or above ground carbon. We integrate all of this from lots and lots of different sources using this kind of big network of collaborators that the lab has to produce this kind of overall database. And then we've got this massive amount of actual on-the-ground observations, and then we combine that with a set of predictors. So the lab's currently got a composite of about 500 predictor data sets. So these are things like the elevation, the temperature, the precipitation, and kind of on through this massive list. We can combine these using this random forest model approach. To build a really good predictive model. So we can say, you know, for this given location at this altitude and given this average annual temperature, what does the tree density look like? And we can sort of work that out based on all of this observational data. And then the model is sort of validated by keeping some subset, normally 5 or 10%, for example, of the training data kind of hidden from the model. And then at the end, we can say, okay, so we've got these observations. We know what the values were measured at. What does the model predict they are? And then we can refine the model until it gets really good at predicting those observations that it didn't see. And then ultimately, we turn this into this wall-to-wall map. So anyone can come onto the Restore platform once that science has been integrated, draw a polygon anywhere. It doesn't matter whether there's ground data or not. And you get an estimate of, what the standing stock of carbon might look like if a site's fully restored, or how many trees there might be once the site is fully restored. So yeah, that's the basics of the modeling approach. Like I said, I will share the overview at the end of the presentation. Then a bit of kind of the behind the scenes of the actual Restore platform and how we're able to generate this data and how we're able to kind of keep up and keep it up to date and keep it relevant and add new data sets fairly easily. So for the we basically load all of these maps into this product called Google Earth Engine, which is based on Google Earth, but has this coding interface, so you can kind of manipulate it and get it to do any calculation you'd like, more or less. We then build out the specific calculation, calculating, you know, is this an average? Is it kind of like a big stack of layers for something like predicting the species composition, and kind of have all of this worked out. And then it means that you can kind of do a direct call, and this facilitates that kind of near instantaneous nature of the data you get back from the platform. So come on, draw a polygon, get this information very, very quickly. And this approach allows us to keep up to date with the science pretty well. So if, say, we've currently got above ground carbon data to 2021, and next month, the European Space Agency publishes a new data set with the updated values for 2022 and 2023. We can then very quickly just go into this behind the scenes bit, load those new maps in, rearrange the calculation code, and then it's ready to go in the platform, and you start to get new information for new sites that are added, and kind of the old sites are all kind of recalculated. And obviously having this flexible approach means that we can start to add new data sets to the platform very easily. It allows for a lot of flexibility around that, and that is something we're working on currently. So we're building towards adding lots of new data, particularly on risk. So we're looking at things like fire risk, flood risk, drought risk, and building up kind of a database there so people can, it particularly helps with planning and sort of funding decisions about how risky any given location is. So that's something that's being incorporated currently. And we kind of, the ethos is that we plan to stay kind of at the cutting edge of the best freely available science that is, that we're able to supply to the users based on what's been published recently, and kind of we're moving forward with that thought. So keep an eye out for new science on the platform coming soon. And then just a bit about the approach of kind of how we decide on what goes into the platform. So like I said, we're currently adding a suite of risk data. So basically we get some requests from a stakeholder. So this could be anyone more or less. So it could be a corporate we're working with. It could be something we hear from webinars like this. And I think it'll be interesting to get some thoughts. So if anyone has any suggestions, like feel free to add those to the chat or discuss in the Q&A, I think, about data sets that they would find valuable in Restore. But we evaluate these requests, we decide we're going to implement one, we then review the scientific literature and kind of the sort of adjacent products, so like these things coming from NASA, for example, and kind of look at the kind of the one that best matches the use case of the stakeholders, and which ones kind of best mesh with the technological stack we have for doing the calculations in Restore. So like the Google Earth Engine backend that I showed you. We'll compare all the pros and cons, pick the best one, kind of decide to work with that, And then we've got very good in-house designers and development team. And we work with them closely to think about kind of what's the most intuitive, straightforward, and visually pleasing way that we can go from this complex geospatial map into just like a nice little indicator of the platform of like how likely is this site to catch fire in the next year, for example. So generally, yep, that is the approach, and that is kind of how we're moving forward. Like I said, we are very much in the process of updating the science currently and working to add things based on the kind of the feedback we hear from the end users. So it would be very interesting to see if people have got ideas about new data sets or types of data they would like to see in the platform. I think that's it. Thanks, everybody.
Huge thanks, Stephen. That was amazing. And I have seen this information under the hood of Restore, and I'm always so impressed. And not only about the art of the possible, but the fact of how well grounded in science what Restore has to offer us all. So thank you so much. And
Thanks.
Thank you for providing that comprehensive overview in such a short amount of time. I'm tempted to ask more questions, and I'm sure that the audience is too. Please share your questions in the chat. And I also want to acknowledge, Stephen, your invitation for all of you to suggest new data of what you would like to see Restore reflect. Restore can collate and assess next steps on that, but just want to put that on the table as well. Before we go into questions, let's move on to Dr. Ian Brettle's presentation on the SEED Index, which will be incredibly enlightening. I find it enlightening always. So over to you, Ian, please.
Thanks, Irene. I assume slide looks fine. You can hear me? Great. Yeah, thank you to the Restore team for giving us the opportunity to share some of what we're working on. I've been spending a lot of my time on SEED as the Kraft Labs policy director. So I'm primarily responsible for taking the lab's research and the cool tools that it builds and making them as useful and impactful in the world. So I've been spending a lot of time on SEED, which is our framework for gathering all, or not all, but as much as possible, as much as feasible of the ecological information that's out there and summarizing it in a way that is understandable and can drive action. And the reason that we're building SEED is to address one of the fundamental drivers of this combined climate and biodiversity crisis, which is our failure to take proper account of nature in our global economic system. But in order to put a price on something, you need to be able to measure it. And with SEED, what we're trying to do is ensure that the way that we measure nature is as holistic as possible, to ensure that we avoid the perverse consequences that we've seen in the carbon market when you only measure or value or optimize for a particular component of nature like carbon. So ecological theory has established that this structure of the system, this biological complexity or biocomplexity as we've characterized it, exists at three scales. And so we have the scale of variation within species at the genetic level. And then above that, we have the scale of between species variation. And then above that, we have the scale of variation that you observe in ecosystems across a landscape. And so the Kraft Lab, over its history, it's been around since 2017. And since then, and even before, it's been either generating itself or collating from the academic literature, hundreds of these global maps that each describe a particular ecological variable that sits somewhere along this spectrum of scales. And so for every terrestrial location, I should note that the Kraft Lab composite currently has over 400 of these global data layers generated using the methodology that Steve just outlined. And each of these is in principle plug and play into Restore, but of course we're only going to provide the ones that are useful and interesting. So out of these, we've taken everything that we think should be included in a holistic biocomplexity index, and we have layers that sit or could be characterized as sitting within either the ecosystem, species, or genetic genetic scale. So at the ecosystem scale, we've got information about ecosystem connectivity and structure and function. We've got lots of information about the diversity of plant and animal and microbial species. And then we have a much smaller amount bound to increase as new technologies and methodologies come online about the within species variation at the genetic level. And so what SEED does is collapse. Oh no. Oh no. I think I just made a slight change to the slides just before I showed them, which is a bad idea. So sorry. So
It's all
essentially,
about Florian, Ian, all good.
so it essentially looks like this, with 9 axes, an axis each for plants, microbes, and animals at the genetic and the species scale, and for structure, connectivity, and function at the ecosystem scale. And we have values that sit for each of these axes that create the yellow shape. And the yellow shape represents the values that a given location, so say this location here, has today. And the outer edges of the radar chart represent the values that that same location would have today if it was only minimally disturbed by humans. And so the
Ian?
relevant comparison is, sorry, yes?
Ian, can you please put it on a bigger, like the presentation slide?
It's just
so
because
we
I'm going to
can see
move
the-
back.
Okay, good.
But yes,
Just so
okay.
we can appreciate, but this is perfect. Thank you so much, Ian.
It's a bit improvised from here. So essentially, for every terrestrial location, we have values that represent what that location has today, and the values that it would have if it were minimally disturbed. So it's a measure of actual versus potential, and the total distances between each of these pair of points gives us a number between 0 and 100, where 0 represents a complete absence of biocomplexity, like concrete, a car park, and 100 represents an ecosystem that is just as intact as its minimally disturbed state. So I'll just take a few steps back here. But essentially, with the radar, we can show, we can then correlate these values with the remotely sensed information to get a view of how the state of nature is changing over time. And so just to give you a peek under the hood, we have, with respect to what layers are feeding into this first version of SEED. Here we can see, I think there's a total of about 77 layers that are feeding into this current version. And you can see how they're hierarchically structured. Each of these are given a weighting as determined by the experts in our SEED team as to how accurate they are in representing on-the-ground conditions. And if we have, say, 2 products that are measuring the same thing, then we give them a weighting of 50%. But essentially they feed down through this structure where ecosystem structure is given a weighting of 1 out of 9, and this ecosystem diversity axis is given a weighting of 1/3, all feeding into the total index. So that's what's in the ecosystem axes. This is the species axes, and you can see the much smaller amount of information that's feeding into the genetic diversity axes, with the microbial and plant genetic diversity axes still under development. So we've got a very talented postdoc working on developing these at the moment. So this is the first version of SEED in a global map form, where you can see high values, so highly intact areas in light colors, and these tend to correspond to the areas that are minimally disturbed by humans. And back to this slide, we launched SEED a few weeks ago at the Conventional and Biological Diversity's COP16 in Cali in Colombia. So we made some fun little maps of the country of Colombia showing what these axes look like as maps as well. So here we have plant diversity at the species scale, got ecosystem function, ecosystem structure, and the overall index. And so one thing to emphasize about SEED is its flexibility as a framework for integrating all sorts of diverse ecological data. So I mentioned the global maps that have been published in the academic literature and the remotely sensed data, but we're also building the capability to integrate ground source data like eDNA, bioacoustics, drones, and camera traps, so that if you go and collect some data in the particular area that you're working on, then ultimately we want to be able to integrate that information and update the SEED index for that area, which will in turn also continue to improve the accuracy of the global model as a whole. And so we're working with a private provider called Nature Metrics, they're the leading eDNA provider, to integrate their eDNA data sets as well as global eDNA data sets to build out these missing layers for within species genetic diversity. And we're building it in a way that it's flexible with the existing frameworks, that it's compatible with the existing frameworks, such as the GeoBond Essential Biodiversity Variables framework. We're looking into displaying the values in different views according to what you're interested in, which particular framework you'd like to observe. And here is a screen grab of seed operational on Restore. So again, for Colombia, I created a polygon of a protected area, which has a high seed score, as you'd expect. Probably would be higher if we didn't have some dummy layers for the plant microbial genetic diversity. So you can see here, you can hover over there, each of the axes, get the value and some extra information about what's feeding into it. So this is currently only available on the Restore Enterprise package, but we'll be rolling it out after we've run this sort of testing and co-development in this beta phase across to the entire platform. So every project on there will have its own seed score. But what we want to move towards next year is to be able to hover over each of the axes and display each of the subcomponents that feed into the axis and the distribution of pixels within your project that shows where it is in relation to the reference values. So the direction that you'd need to travel and the distance that you need to travel to bring that component back towards natural. So it can start to inform your interventions at an increasingly granular level. So I'll leave that there. Thank you for your attention and very happy to take questions.
Huge thanks, Ian. That was again impressive and so exciting and timely to see that the seed index is coming into fruition. Of course, we all know there's immense need for common ground of understanding all of our nature efforts globally. So before, and I've already been looking at the questions in the chat, huge thanks to you all for first introducing yourselves and also for sharing the questions. As seed is rapidly evolving, it would be great to understand, before we go into the specific questions, how you believe seed can be useful for your own efforts. And we really want to gather this information because it can serve as input to inform features that the team developing seed can look into. So I'd like to ask Marina Duarte, again from Brazil, to help us here in launching the last poll. And please feel free to use the chat to share other answers and details. Marina, please.
Thanks a lot, Irene. So again, we have another question here about how you're willing to use seed, and please take a minute to answer it. I guess now you're seeing the results here. Again, we have diverse answers, but the most use of SEED would be in monitoring restoration outcomes and identifying sites where restoration is most needed. So back to you, Irene.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And we really appreciate your inputs on the poll. It's very useful and helps us respond to needs of those who are actually making the efforts on the ground, which is where we all need to drive impact. So moving into the questions and answers. Thanks again for sharing your questions. I'm very much interested in opening up on them. So let's dive into that. So I see a first group of questions around understanding impact over time, and thanks, Eliza, if I'm pronouncing that right. Apologies if not, for that question. Eliza is working on federally funded restoration projects in the US and really wants to understand whether data can be made available to understand the impact before and after restoration efforts. So that's one group of questions. The other is around the interactive nature of the data and how we can further enrich restored data with ground truthing data. So we have Walt's question there. I appreciate that, Walt. And Walt wants to know whether there's a role for practitioners on the ground to add this ground truthing data from local drones and flora and fauna soil sampling. So that's one question. Ekaterina also reflects that she has been collecting observation using different apps and how she can upload these to Restore. And Eliza as well wants to really understand which data sets would be most useful and how much standardization is needed to do that. So I'm going to pause on those two themes and open up to Dr. Stephen Thomas and Dr. Ian Brettel. Stephen, please, over to you first.
Cool. Yeah, I guess these are kind of more leaning towards the presentation that I gave. So to answer the ground truthing question first, that is definitely a direction we want to head in, and kind of it is a bit of an ultimate goal for Restore. So we've got over 100,000 public sites on the platform now. If we could get people to start providing ground data for those, we could ultimately build a new database of, so in the same way I showed kind of how the modeling works, if people could send in data on, reporting the species they're seeing on the ground or some estimate of how ecologically intact the site is, if we start to kind of gather that data en masse and it comes back to the Crowther Lab, it could be that that's the basis for new scientific models and ultimately new predictive maps across the globe. So yeah, that is definitely something we want to build towards. And in time, we will modify Restore more so it's better able to kind of accept this data coming from the ground. So it'll have some format for providing numerical ground data. And there will also be this facility to ultimately include photographic data or data from drones, for example. So we do have like a tree crown delineation model that we've built out, and ultimately this will be integrated into the public version of Restore. So you can do a drone survey of the site, send the drone footage back to us, and then we can give an estimate of kind of the number of trees at a site and various other metrics about the trees there. And then the second question was about the before and after. I'm not sure I fully understood the context of that, but was it to do with monitoring, for example? So from when you started the intervention and kind of what it looks like into the future, is that right? Was it Eliza asked that?
Eliza, yes, it was precisely about that. But Eliza, if you take off mute, you can come in on.
Thank you. So I work on a few projects, and so the high level federally funded projects, so projects with like NOAA and the National Park Service, they need a certain amount of time. I don't know the specifics of pre-restoration monitoring, so monitoring water quality, some like very large scale projects are also doing additional monitoring with the USGS, so monitoring like carbon capture, like carbon emissions, and then carbon capture and running pilot studies. So one project I work on has like probably at this point at least a decade of pre-restoration monitoring, and then it's like a phased restoration, so they'll continue to conduct, post and kind of during restoration as well. But obviously that's a lot of data. So I'm just curious of like what specific metrics would be most useful. And I don't know if you guys have the answer to that yet, but I'm curious if you've thought of that already.
So yeah, I don't think I can speak to which ones would be most useful. I can
Yeah.
talk a bit about the data we have on the platform and kind of how it might be useful for that use case. So we do capture data. So for all the sites that people upload, we ask that they provide kind of the pre-intervention land use type, so kind of what was going on there before they intervened, the intervention they're doing, whether they're doing passive natural regeneration or they're doing tree planting or some other intervention, and then the habitat they're aiming for. So kind of it might be that this was arable land, we're doing active restoration of forest, so we get a bit of an idea of what the trajectory might look like. And then we also ask for the year they started that. And then we've obviously got the monitoring data sets that I described. So if you go on and kind of upload a site, you can kind of look at kind of these change through time graphs. And they don't just start kind of at the period where you've indicated the start year, but they also go back in time. Some of them go back as far as 2001, I think, in the current platform. And there's also visible imagery. So it could be that you kind of, obviously it'll work better for some habitat types and ecosystem types than others. But if you're restoring forest, for example, you could upload your polygon, put in the start year, just get an idea of kind of what it looks like now and then kind of how that's progressed. But then you can also look backwards as well and say, oh, the NDVI value, which is kind of the greenness of the vegetation, has changed by this amount over time. Same for kind of the amount of carbon the site's taken up, same for the amount of kind of water cycling through the site. So you get some idea. So we haven't really built it kind of with that backwards looking focus. And I think that is something we could adapt to potentially. But yeah, there are some tools in the platform where you can say, hey, this site in 2010, before we'd done anything with it, or 10 years before we started the intervention, was only taking up 2 tons of carbon per hectare, but now it's taking up 30 tons of carbon per hectare. So there are some ways you can use the platform to kind of show before and after.
Thanks, Stephen, for that overview. I think that covers all of those points. We have a lot of more questions. This is very exciting, particularly on the sources of information that Restore and Seed use. So we have questions from Ekaterina on the use of traditional statistical machine learning approaches and whether Restore uses that, or also nonlinear dynamic systems. Also from Anali on seed, is there whether there's a minimum size required to measure biodiversity using seed, and what is the accuracy of those measurements? There are more questions about seed, Ian, that you can see on the chat. And I'm just conscious of time. I'll add 2 more around the seed index. One from Swavanti. Apologies if I got that wrong, Swavanti. And whether the seed index builds on the biodiversity index and forest intactness from the GFW, and about the temporal resolution, Ian. Lastly, Ian, on the seed index and how it can guide directional change, again, that impact over change that Stephen just went into on Restore. Please, Ian, if you could come in on a broader perspective, but also specifically on seed. So, Ian, over to you first, please.
Okay, I'll probably leave the question on statistical methods to Steve. I'll send him that hospital pass. Anali, if I'm reading it correctly, if you mean minimum size of biodiversity, is that the size of the plot you're interested in? Because if so, it's something that I should have made clearer about the resolution of seed in its current form and where it's going next year. So in its current form, seed has a 1 kilometer pixel size, so 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. and it is a static over time. So it's given that many of the inputs have been based on observations that have been collected over a long period of time. It's a static average over around the last 10 years. Now, obviously, that's not very useful. And it only becomes very useful once we have that time series. And so next year, starting with the ecosystem level metrics, because most of them are remotely sensed and already have time series, we're going to start to build out and release seed that shows change over time for at least the ecosystem and the species scales, with the further challenge to identify changes in within species genetic variation based purely on remote sense data. That's a challenge that we're going to have to keep developing into the future. So, short answer: currently it's a 1 kilometer pixel size static over time. Next year, change over time at an annual interval, which we'll want to get down to monthly. And we're looking to shrink the pixel size down to 30 by 30 meters so that we can start to run the analyses at the site scale, which is, I think, what most Restore users are interested in. To Swathani's question, does Seed build on Global Forest Watch? I'll need to go back and check what data sets they have there and whether any of them fall within Seed. But what I will do is link in the chat the preprint that describes Seed fully, and includes a link to a supplementary table that sets out exactly what the layers are that are feeding into the current version and the weights that have been ascribed to them. And then the final question is how it can guide change. So this is something that I'm very excited about, and I'll just share my screen again. Because I really like this. So Restore has now over 210,000 projects listed on the site, and that number is continuing to grow. And when you set up a project, you need to provide a small amount of information, but a couple of mandatory pieces are which intervention you've been applying and the date on which you began to apply them. And so if you combine the Restore database with the seed metric, once we have the time series, then we can start to run these natural experiments where for a given area, country, eco-region, we can see that some projects are applying one type of practice, another type of projects are applying a different one. We can compare them with respect to the changes in the seed index from the date on which they made that intervention. And we can start to see which interventions lead to the greatest uplifts in biodiversity, particularly for the same dollar that's been invested. And then we can start to make projections. So we can start to say, okay, this intervention is likely to deliver a greater uplift in biodiversity. We can begin to disseminate that information in an increasingly automated fashion through the Restore platform, and we're hoping that will give an interesting set of information to start to guide those restoration actions. So I hope that answers your questions, but please feel free to ask for some elaborations in the chat, and I'll do my best.
Thanks so much, Ian. And now over to you, Stephen, on Restore and this point of using traditional statistical machine learning or also the nonlinear modeling.
Sure. So the lab generally uses this random forest approach, which is quite good at dealing with non-linear relationships between these predictors and the measured data. I've linked in the chat the preprint I mentioned, so it's different to the one that Ian just mentioned. This is on the analytical pipeline the lab uses to go from this wealth of kind of ground collected observations into the predictive model, and there's kind of a really full detailed explanation there. And then more generally, the lab has a dedicated and very enthusiastic data science team who kind of always kind of look to kind of push things forward and use kind of the most advanced statistical methods available to get the kind of the most accurate results from the ground data that we're collecting. And if people are interested, I could put them in touch with the relevant people from the team. But yeah, like I said, the preprint that I've linked in the chat would be the best place to look for a kind of a comprehensive overview of the modeling approach used, and kind of, yeah, how we go from just a massive ground data into something tangible that we can model and map. And then I think there was, Irani, you mentioned there was a question about the data sources. So that is quite a good thing to point out. So if you go into the Restore platform and generate the scientific insights, they're quite easy to miss, but you can see small info buttons. So basically there's a lowercase I in a circle. If you click those, and it'll give you a very short description of what the data is, and just describes what the metric is. But if you click show more, it'll pop up a big description of the data. It'll show you the academic publication or the data source if it's coming from somewhere like NASA. So you can click in and kind of see really in-depth the details there. And it'll also provide information on the spatial resolution, the temporal resolution, and kind of caveats and uncertainty associated with the data. So what it can and can't tell you, what you should bear in mind, and kind of what the error around the estimate we're giving might look like.
Thanks,
Yep.
Stephen. And now back to you, Ian, on further elaboration on SEED. This is super exciting that we're going into the details. So there's a question from Lou about how we integrate occurrence data from eBird and iNaturalist, which I know you're very excited about. And also about the interaction of SEED index and data inputs related to biocomplexity. Yeah, so the citizen science, iNaturalist being one example. So that's one group of questions. Paul had a question, Ian, about whether SEED recognizes fruiting trees to collect the seeds. Interesting in this movement that we need to pivot to regeneration. So put that on the table for you, Ian, as well. And then this bigger question of from Francis of how does SEED link to natural capital? So let's round up on that for you, Ian.
I'm sorry, Ian, I got the last two, but what were the first two?
Okay, the first one was about integrating occurrence data from eBird and iNaturalist from Lou, and also Walt in the same vein was asking about how SEED responds to the ground source data related to biocomplexity in general citizen science apps. So those were the first two questions.
Okay, thank you. So with respect to eBird and iNaturalist, I mean, we're huge fans of those tools and platforms, but those data sets feed directly into the GBIF database, Global Biodiversity Information Facility. It's been around for decades. It's totally open access, and researchers, including the Crowther Lab, use it all the time. So essentially, every time you use you upload an observation through either of those platforms, then that feeds into the database that we then use to build the maps that feed into SEED. And so it's a really frictionless way to ensure that your observations are being incorporated. How that relates to SEED's responsiveness to ground source data. So when these models have been built using hundreds of thousands, if not millions of observations from around the world, adding a single observation in your area of interest, even if there were no previous observations in that area, are likely to make very little difference to the model. And so what we're thinking through now is whether we do a repeated rebuild of the maps based on any new observations, or not necessarily alternatively, we show that information side by side, or give it a sort of a weighting together with SEED to ensure that it's given more value than it would if it was just shoved into a data set of an existing 100,000 or million data points. So something that we're trying to figure out as we go, and haven't settled on a specific methodology yet, but we're definitely thinking about it because it's something that almost everyone asks for. With respect to seed being able to identify fruiting trees, can seed recognize fruiting trees to collect seeds? The seed as an aggregator or synthesizer of existing products is only as good as its inputs. And so if there's a remote sensing product there that is of sufficiently high resolution to recognize fruiting trees, then that's something that seed can do, but it would make more sense to just go directly to the remotely sensed layer, and maybe that's something that Restore can look into housing if such a layer exists. I know that the Planet Labs, the remote sensing satellite imagery provider, puts a strong emphasis on not so much spatial resolution, but temporal resolution. And so maybe that's if there's a very narrow window in which the tree is fruiting, then maybe that's a good product to look into. And then finally, with respect to natural capital, I mean the purpose of seed is to be able to measure the state of nature, and to provide us holistic and high resolution assessment of that state of nature, so that it can inform financial incentive structures that make it a lot more expensive to degrade nature and can generate income for doing things that improve it. And so we've done a lot of thinking about biodiversity credits, and we think that the concept is flawed because, as most people in this space agree, they shouldn't be used as offsets. And yet, if they can't be used for offsets, then who's going to buy them? We think that the much better approach to move away from the logic of carbon credits and to take nature as in the unique way that it is to set up a system that can value every terrestrial location on Earth for its I mean, ideally intrinsic worth, but more practically for the ecosystem services that flow from it. And so we're in discussions now with many different partners on how best to make that operational. And so I just say watch this space there.
And huge thanks, Ian, for going into that massive question, and definitely want to respect everyone's time and appreciate the fact that we're 1 minute over. I want to thank both Steve and Ian for sharing your insights and expertise, and thank you all for joining. It's truly inspiring to see how Restore Scientific Foundation innovations like the Seed Index are helping to shape a more transparent and effective global restoration movement. And that's why these webinars are so important. These questions that you bring to the table, I think we should definitely follow up on a webinar on these bigger points of natural capital, of transparency. I love the points that raised by our colleague of Lebanon that includes accountability. We definitely want to double down on that. So before we close, I'd like to thank everyone for joining and contributing to today's discussion. Your work on the ground is essential, and it's what moves everything. So please keep an eye out for the recording and feel free to share it with your networks. Don't forget to connect with each other, of course, and with us to keep the conversation going. So let's continue, all of us, to build transparency, to share knowledge and support one another's efforts in this journey towards a more just, equitable, nature positive and net zero future. So thank you everyone for joining. We'll share more responses to the questions following this webinar. And more importantly, thank you for your contributions. Until next time, thank you so much.